This is something that I talk a lot about in our Summer Institute in the past, and I want to do this as a way to get us started, to kind of warm up our ideas on how to think about technology. So this idea of technology and faith is something that I think a lot about often, and it is integrated into how we operate as an office. Being at a faith-based school, we do take it seriously, the role of academic faith integration, what we do. And so I wanted to share a couple of thoughts about how technology appears in the Bible, in scholarship, and also in our day-to-day practices. And so I want to highlight a few Bible verses here for us to consider. So in Genesis 11:6, we have the Lord saying, if as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. This is obviously referring to the Tower of Babel, and when man created this tower trying to get to heaven, and God sort of just looked at them and said, no, this is a pretty amazing feat, and the whole emphasis here I want to pull out is this idea of the same language. They say in the 21st century, the three most dominant languages in the world will be English, Chinese, and programming. And programming is universal. I mean, the programming language is what runs the internet. It's what runs software. It's what running our session today. And so it's something that will be very, very pervasive in going into the future. And in many ways, we can say that we are in some ways speaking the same language as the world today. Another verse that I think is very important for us to consider is this, comes from 1 Corinthians 10:23. It says, I have the right to do anything, Paul says, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. And this is just a basic principle that the Apostle Paul talks about, this idea of we have full liberty and freedom in Christ. But because we are in Christ, not everything we do would be beneficial or would be constructive. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means when it comes to technology, that just because a technology exists and it can do amazing things, it doesn't mean that it's absent from sin or it's absent from the things that we can do with it that would dishonor God. And then finally, a third verse I want to share with you is from Colossians 1:16. And it says, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. And this emphasis at the end is what I want us to kind of focus in on, is that everything under heavens, and I would now include technology, Zoom, Canvas, everything you can imagine was created by him, created through him and for him. And I'll talk again also about how we can really leverage technology to honor God as opposed to dishonor him. So that's what you see in terms of technology referenced in the Bible. And here I want to talk about this idea of technology in a biblical framework of the whole. We know that from the last verse we just saw that everything comes from him. It's and the idea that technology is not different, that God has endowed humans to have the ability to creativity, intelligence, to create technology. We were able to do this because God allowed it to, and it is good. It's a God-given gift that we can, we have technology, that we can develop technology, and that we can use it. But as humans, with every human creation, it is subject to the curse, and technology is not anything different. Anything good can be made perverse, and in many ways, our society has turned technology into things that aren't honorable to God and to people. But technology can be used to honor God in a way that I think is very redemptive, but also it can be used to dishonor God in a way that continues the injustices and inequities in the world. It's not very hard to think about examples of things that dishonor God, like cyberbullying, like pornography, like just lots and lots of things that are just not honorable and not pleasing and not right and not good. But finally, the last point I want to make about technology is that because technology has so many affordances, it gives us the ability to do so many things that we weren't able to do before. It can actually become a counterfeit God. And this is from a term from Tim Keller, who's a pastor in New York, a former pastor in New York, and he talks about this idea of anything good can be made into a counterfeit God. And I think technology often can play this role of a counterfeit God. We look at our phones. I think the last study I read was about 80 times a day. The question I have for all of us is, how many times do we turn to God in an average day? Do we even turn to God half of that time that we look to the phone, or do we, continue to look to our technologies for answers, or the first thing we do to find anything, we look to the phone? So I think that's a very visible reminder that we can turn to technology as a counterfeit God without even knowing. As Christian educators, I think we can take, the understanding of the technology and the role of our faith and what can we do with it. And so the first thing I would encourage all Christian educators to consider is that we really can embrace technology because it is a gift from God. It is a tool that God has given us, and we can embrace it, and we can use it, and we can continue to leverage it to really advance His kingdom in many ways. Also, I think we can use technology in reflective and redemptive ways. We want to sort of reap the benefits. We want to use, I journal in my on my phone on an app regularly. I read my Bible on my app and on my computer regularly. So there are many, many ways that I think I personally use technology in a reflective and redemptive way. And that's something that I think all of us can do as Christian educators. Number 3 is help students use technology to honor God and to love people. And this is where I think is especially important for us as Christian educators in this time during the remote teaching away from campus experience, because we're modeling for our students as they join our Zoom classes, as they see us on Canvas, as they see how we approach and use technology, that they're looking to us in how we're modeling this use of technology. And the more we can sort of point them to God and point them to how this tool can be used to advance God's kingdom, then I think that's something that we can really lean in on. And then finally, I think we need to speak truth to technology's power to become like God. I oftentimes like to remind myself and others around me that if we're not careful, whether it's technology or anything, if we're not careful and we take technology at its sort of face value or wholesale without critically thinking about what we're doing or what we're doing with it, then we automatically, in some ways, we kind of start to, it's going to morph into a counterfeit God without us even knowing. And lastly, well, maybe there might be one more, is this idea of how do you do faith integration with educational technology. So these are just some basic principles. First is that we develop wisdom about the use of technology together. Second is that we use technology to do more creation and more consumption. And what I mean by that is, today's session, I will kind of talk a little bit about this, is that oftentimes we watch way more things than we create things in terms of video. And so creating lectures today is one act we can do that will allow us to create more than we consume. A third principle is that we really need to take Sabbath from the technology in our lives. I try to turn off all my technologies from Saturday sundown to Sunday sundown, so that I have a 24-hour where I minimize my use of technology. I don't do a perfect job. I still watch TV or I still check my phone from time to time, but for the most part, I try to take a break from those things. And number 4 is about using screens purposefully. The idea of not just aimlessly surfing the web for entertainment. I always tell our kids this, that when you get on your computer, you have to have a purpose. Don't just get on and figure out what you're going to do. You need to know what you're going to do and then get on and do what you do and then get off, so that you don't waste a lot of time on it. And then finally, this idea of committing to physical and virtual communities. I know it's very difficult during this time, and social distancing is a real thing in our society, and it will be for the foreseeable future. And so how do we continue to commit to these communities, whether it's virtual or physical, in a way that will allow us to build the body of Christ? And so those are just some basic tips for us to use technology in a meaningful way. I drew a lot of my thinking from these books. I highly encourage you to read them and just look into what they may, how they may speak to you. So with that, I will now turn our attention to recording lecture. So I will be doing part 1 today. And Tim Schreffler will be doing part 2 and 3. So I will just preface this session by talking about this idea of recording lectures. I know there's lots to be said about this. I even thought about having a whole section about how should we talk about whether the lecture is dead or not, or what's the value of lectures, and many perspectives about lectures. But just for our purposes today, if you don't like the word lecture, you can replace it with learning materials or instructional materials, or just different ideas of how you want to engage your students with learning, and you want to record that. So just quick preface on the word lecture that may cause some people to stumble. Here's our sort of learning map, or a curriculum map, if you will. We will have chunked our topic into 3 parts. The first part is the pre-production, and the goal, learning outcome of that is that we want you to be able to identify the essential pre-production considerations, when you are recording your lecture. And then the activities will be doing mostly presentation, and then we'll have opportunities for discussion. And hopefully through that process, you'll get a little understanding about some of the preparation work that needs to happen. In session 2, Tim will demonstrate the use of recording software like Screencastify and PowerPoint. These are tools that you might have heard of. I mean, PowerPoint for sure everybody has heard of, and Screencastify I think many of you may know already. But he's going to give a demonstration of how those tools work, and also to provide really tips and answer questions that you may have about how that technology works, and the pro tips around that. And then finally, we'll end the day around how we manage and we share these video files that you will create. There's lots of options and ways you can do that, and we hopefully can save you some time on how to avoid some of the pitfalls and to make it accessible and easy for you and your students. So let's just start with what we understand as traditional lecture. We typically think of a lecture as being long. I'd say about 60 minutes or 50 minutes, and it's unscripted. And when I mean unscripted, it means you don't write every word before you talk in a lecture. Most faculty do not. They usually have key points or slides, and they talk through them. They usually cover more than one topic, because in a 60 or 50 minute time block, it can it's a long time, and faculty want to make sure they cover as much content as they can during that time. It's also, it happens in real time. You know, traditional lectures usually are not recorded, and so students who are there, they get to benefit, they get to take notes, they get to follow along. But if you don't if you missed a part of it, or you fell asleep, or you didn't show up, it's tough luck. You can't, you know, there's really no way to get the actual source except to ask your friends for their notes, or to ask the instructor for their PowerPoint slides. And I would say traditional lectures are very instructor friendly because it's a very comfortable format that a lot of instructors have been used to. And finally, it's very limited when it comes to its its interoperability, its ability to share and to repurpose and to, you know, make it accessible. It's a lot more limited in that respect. So unlike traditional lecture, I think microlectures, I think, offer many benefits that are sort of different than what traditional lectures offer. One is it's much shorter. You know, typically when you talk about micro lectures, it's usually less than 10 minutes long. It's very scripted. It's on a very tightly controlled topic. And it's self-paced, meaning that once you record it, students can go as fast as they want or as slow as they want, or they can pause, they can rewind, they can forward, they can do things that you just can't do with a real-time lecture. It's also very student friendly because once it's recorded and students can access it digitally, they can take it with them on their mobile devices. They, you know, if you want to do the audio version, they can listen to it as part of a podcast. It's very amenable to the student life sometimes that they have trying to juggle work and school and many other priorities. And then lastly, I think it's very shareable. You know, once you create these series of micro lectures, you get to put it on inside your Canvas course. You get to share it in your emails. You get to, you know, just package it in different ways. You can put, you know, a couple of micro lectures together to share with a group of students who may be struggling with this particular part of the class. I mean, there's just many ways you can package and share that content. This is a table, a 2x2 table by Daniel Stanford. He is the director of faculty development and technology innovation at DePaul University. Right at the onset of COVID-19, he started a list gathering resources on the POD network, and it's grown, you know, to hundreds, if not thousands, of listings of different resources that different schools are sharing about how to, you know, help with the continuity of courses. And he did a blog a couple of weeks after that at the beginning, and he, you know, I think this is a really good 2x2 to think about where does the video lectures fall into the big scheme of things. So if you look at the top right corner where it's high bandwidth and high immediacy. So high bandwidth refers to how much technology and computer processing power it needs. And then high immediacy refers to the idea of social presence, how connected you feel with the person on screen, how just, you know, how real are they? And so you see video conferences and audio conferences like we're doing right now is very high bandwidth and very high immediacy. You feel like it's real, like it's happening in real time. Yes, the technology is there, but you still feel like because I'm doing this in live setting, it feels like, you know, a lot more real than it's something that's recorded. And then you go to the top left quadrant where you see the pre-recorded video. And this is where, you know, what we'll be talking about today is this idea of pre-recorded. It's still very high bandwidth. It takes some internet bandwidth to be able to view videos on camera, on your phone or on your computer. But it's much less immediate, meaning it takes, it's not real time, but I would argue later that even though it's low immediacy in terms of watching something that's recorded, the authenticity of how you record things actually can make it higher in its sense of social presence. And then there's also different versions of, you know, you can do pre-recorded audio only, or you can do asynchronous discussions with video, which you can do in Canvas, and the asynchronous discussion with audio. So these are just different variations of that. And then the bottom two quadrants are essentially the lower bandwidth activities you can do, things like discussion boards and collaborative documents. And yesterday, Paul, actually last 2 days, Paul Cack and Stephanie Fenwick, they shared a Google collaborative document that everybody was able to participate, and it didn't really, I think it's if you don't have a video high bandwidth capable internet service, you could still participate that in a fairly easy way, and also just chatting and messaging. So those are, I think, something, it's good to see. I think this picture, it's also very helpful to kind of understand where pre-recorded video is in relation to all the other technologies that we talk about. This guy here is someone you might know who he is. His name is Salman Khan, and he was the founder of Khan Academy. This is a TED Talk he gave back in 2011. It's almost a decade, but I think, this is, video lectures is not anything new. It's actually been longer than, 9 years since Salman Khan kind of made it popular. If you know about Salman Khan, he's the guy who started, basically, he had a niece, or I think a niece in his home country, in India, I believe, and he was here in the US, and he wanted to tutor her in math, and he didn't know how to do it well. And so what he did was he just started recording his own math sessions and explaining things, and then he would then email those files to his niece, and then his niece would watch it and then ask more questions, and he'd create the next video, and so on. And that's sort of how Khan Academy started. And so in this video, the TED Talk video, and by the way, TED Talk is actually a great example of a micro lecture. It's a little longer than 10 minutes. Usually it's under 20 minutes, but it's a great format for modeling, these micro lectures. So Salman Khan, in this talk, he talks about this idea of using video to reinvent education. He talks about how video can impact teaching and learning and encourage teachers to consider the flipped classroom model. And this is something that we've talked about a lot in ITT workshops in the past, and past institutes. We're not going to focus too much here today, except just to say that flipped learning is the idea of taking the lecture out of the class, putting that online, and then using the class time for more higher interaction, more active learning kind of activities. And so using video to flip the classroom is something that's very popular. It's been done quite a bit in recent years, and something that I think with a recorded lectures you can do, because you can essentially take a lot of that content you used to share during your class time, put it in a video form, put it inside the Canvas course, and then be able to then use that time in your classroom to be able to focus on discussions or teasing out more of the concepts or going more in depth on things. And so this is, I encourage you to go and look up this TED Talk if you haven't had a chance to see it. Just it's that title is right there. Let's use video to reinvent education. So video lectures, I want to argue, improves learning. And there's been many, many studies and researchers have looked at this. I'm going to draw from one particular scholar. His name's Richard Mayer, and he was the guy who, in some ways, the grandfather of multimedia learning and design. He's been writing about this for 20 plus years, and lots of his principles are now taken almost for granted. We don't even think about it when we are using some of these principles. And so a basic principle that he shared in his books is talking about this idea of multi-modality principle, which basically means that if you add narration, the audio part to a text or to or picture, you enhance the learning experience. Sort of like what I have here, as you can see in my slides, and most of my slides you'll see this, that there's text on it, and then there's usually an image, but then you're listening to my voice. And so those combinations actually are they call it multimodal learning. Each each of those are different channels, cognitive channels that your brain is taking in. And as you do that, the brain actually synthesizes all that together and makes it very effective learning, versus if you're just reading alone, or if you're just listening to audio alone, or if you're just looking at a picture alone. So that's the idea of the modality principle, is that you kind of combine these modes of learning to really enhance learning. Another principle that Mayer really promoted was this idea of learner-controlled principle. And basically what learner-control means is that you give the learner control of the rate at which they can intake information. Meaning, in a recorded lecture, they can pause at any moment. They can speed it up or they can slow it down. And that's the ultimate learner control, if you will, of lectures. Because in real time, in a real classroom, if the instructor is talking too fast, maybe like I am right now, there's no way for the student to stop. It's like, can you pause without interrupting the entire class, or without really, creating other problems for, for the instructor? And so a recorded lecture is one of those great, things that, students can watch it many, many times over and over, and they can slow it down, for people who may be international students. They may not be able to understand as quickly in terms of the fluency of their language, and so they need slower speed. They can do that. So lots of great benefits to recorded lectures in terms of learner control. It really re-emphasizes this idea of learner control. A third principle that Mayer shared that's related to video lectures is this idea of segmenting, or chunking. Or this idea of a micro lecture. I mean, they're all in some ways referring to the same thing. And the idea is you break it down into digestible segments to increase and enhance learning experience. And so the idea is there's so much content. Sometimes in an hour lecture in class, you could be talking about 5, 6, things, and it's just hard to remember all of them. And think about Sunday service sermons for all of us who, like usually it's a 3-point sermon. Even a 3-point sermon an hour later, or that evening on Sunday night, you're trying to remember, like, what was that third point of that sermon? And so it's just the brain does not do well with too many information in a short amount of time. And so what recorded the micro lecture, the segmenting does is it gives the brain a very focused, limited time to focus on one thing. And that way, the brain can kind of intake that, process that, and then, be able to master that. So these are just basic principles that I think have been proven to improve learning, and we can apply this very easily to video lectures. I'm going to now talk a little bit about some basic equipment that's needed to do video lecture recording. Here is sort of I would say the base equipment, the webcam. I'm using this webcam. I'm not using the microphone that's part of the webcam, but some of you may not need an external headset, and just the webcam usually will have a microphone recorded. And if you're in an office setting or a room where there's not external noises, then this is all you really need. You can also invest in a headset, and I actually advise if you can to do this, because the headset, I always prefer headset because it minimizes all the extraneous sounds around you, the surrounding sounds. I have 3 kids in the house right now, and sometimes they're playing piano, or they're watching TV, or they're arguing, or whatever. And without the headset, using just the mic from the webcam, it picks up all that. And so I'm just going to use my headset as a way to control that the volume of the audio, so that it minimizes any kind of distraction. And then this is really a luxury. I don't have this, and I don't think it's necessary. I'm using my natural, the virtual background in Zoom that I think is showing my my beachfront property. And but if you are into recording a lot of great lectures with backgrounds, let's say if you're a history professor and you want to show some scenes of the the time period of the place you're talking about, then you might want to put on a green screen and put a slide of that. So creative things you can do if you want to use a green screen. Here are just some real quick pro tips on using webcams. I'm not going to go into this because the webcam is something that these are basic kind of tips that in general, if you can do, it will improve the quality of the recording. But again, you can do recorded lectures just with audio and not the video part, and you don't have to worry about these things. So for example, camera eye level. So right now I've set up my webcam in a way that I'm looking straight at it. So the camera's I'm not looking down the camera. I'm not looking up at the camera. I'm just looking straight at the camera. And that makes it a lot more, I think, authentic and real in terms of how you would talk with people in real life. This idea of, looking straight into the camera as opposed to a screen. I have my notes on the side, which I refer to. And when I do that, what it appears to the audience is that I'm looking away from them. And so it's just, it's a practice that you just develop as you talk and do more recorded lectures. You just get used to looking into the camera as opposed to looking at other places. A third tip is this idea of getting a microphone closer to the mouth. And if you have a headset, it's like right there. But if it's if you're using the microphone on your webcam, then it may be a little bit distant. And if you turn away, the mic may not pick up your audio. And so that's just a matter of if you use a headset or not. Number 4 is this idea of reducing blue monitor light. The monitor, I actually have 2 monitors in front of me, and it's very bright. And if I'm not careful, it can actually wash my face out. And so I've turned both of my monitors to a warmer color so that it doesn't have that that glow. If you have phones that have a night mode, usually that turns into a warmer glow. That's what I've done with my monitor, and you can do that if you choose. It's not necessary. You can light your face and avoid any silhouette. The key thing is you can have a bright background like I do, but as long as there's enough lighting on your face, then you're good. I mean, that's really the key. They want, people want to see your face and not a shadow of your face. So, and then lastly, manage your background. I'm not doing a great job really in my background. I mean, I have some stuff back there, but it's not, I should be cleaner, but I mean, I think it's good for now, especially given our situation. My desk is somewhat stuck in a place, so it's hard for me to move, and if I move, then my whole setup is just whacked. So I didn't want to do any of that. But those are just some pro tips for you to consider as you use your webcam. I want to talk about some recording environment considerations, something that I think all of us need to do, especially at home nowadays, as we record from wherever we can find space. This idea of a sound management is very important. The ideal, I've actually read quite a few articles, and they talk about this idea. You can actually, if you can find a closet in your house, close the door, have enough light, that would be the ideal recording environment, because the clothes will actually absorb the hard sounds, and it's a very controlled environment. I've actually been listening to a lot of podcasts, and they talk about recording nowadays. A lot of podcasters now record in their closet because they can't go to their office sound booth anymore, and so it's a it's a new development, recording in your closet, but it's a very easy adjustment you can do if you can just make some space, if you have some closet space. But just the key idea is find a quiet space, minimum background noise is the key. Second consideration is this idea of lighting. You want to have soft light on your face, like sort of what I have right now, and you want to come from the same direction as the camera as much as possible. And the background thing I said earlier is it can be bright. If you can't control like a window or something, outside lighting, then at least as long as the light is on your face and it's clearly showing your face, then that's really the key there in terms of lighting. And then lastly, it's about the background, control the clutter and remove any distracting objects. I probably need to stop my virtual background because I think that might be distracting for some people because, of the ways that, maybe people may be distracted with, but. So slide preparations. Again, I'm going to draw from Richard Mayer because he has so many great principles here that relates to slide preparation. The first one is this idea of what he calls multimedia principle. So a combination of two mediums of presentation in one multimedia product produces greater learning outcomes than a single presentation method alone. All that to say is, if you have a word by itself, it's good, but if you have a word, in this, for example, of dog, and you have a picture of a dog, together, those things actually is a better learning experience. It actually produces a higher learning outcome. So that's always important to consider as you create slides. And that's what I always try to do with my slides is that the words are great, but I try to find images that reinforce what the words are saying. And if you can do that in your slides, that's really the key to multimedia principle. This idea of coherence principle. So avoid extraneous information and less is more. In my slides, I just avoid any clutter as much as possible. Neutral background, very, very simple text and simple graphics, because you don't want to add anything on your slides that don't add to your message or add to your main point. And if you do, what happens is your students will get distracted and they will look at all these other things, and instead of focusing on your narration or focusing on the key concept, they're looking at all these other things. So just minimize any kind of distractions as much as possible. And then the last principle for slide preparation is this idea of contiguity principle. And it's just placing pieces of related content in as close proximity to the actual concept as you can. So if you look at the two examples here, and at the top, you have the label of A, B, and C of a dog, different parts of a dog, and then you have the words at the very top. I mean, that's not ideal because if you could put those parts of the dog directly in the picture, pointing to that part of the dog, like to the tail, the body, the head, learners actually can put those two pieces of information together. In some ways, it's reinforcing the multimedia principle. And so as you do your slides, just, as you, if you have a lot of things going on, try to label things as clearly as possible and don't use too many legends, because legends sometimes is very difficult to read if you have like 10 things on the chart and you have 10 things on the list and it's color coded and you're trying to figure out like, is this shade of red referring to this shade of the pie graph? I mean, it can be confusing, and learning is just not helpful in that situation. I want to just spend a little bit more time on this idea of chunking, because I think it's really at the heart of this micro-lecture concept. So George Miller in 1956, if you could believe it, 1956, he talked about this idea of chunking content to improve learning. And what basically his conclusion was that the mind is only able to hold so many chunks of information at a time. Back in 1956, he actually argued that the working memory can hold up to 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information at once. But in more recent neurological studies and learning studies, we've actually debunked that and say that the mind really is capable of holding no more than 4, at most 5 things, and maybe it's closer to 2. The mind isn't able to hold a lot of things in the working memory all at once. And so this is especially true when it comes to complicated information, especially if you're teaching upper division or teaching graduate courses or teaching concepts that are just very abstract, or it just takes a lot of brain power to process. The brain just can only hold so much. And so you need to break that up. And so, so Miller basically says, why don't we, chunk the content to make it easier for the learner? And so this idea of, for example, psychological foundation is the course that you're teaching, or it's maybe the topic of the day, in a psychology class. And it's typically 15 minutes long that you would talk about psychological foundations. And, you can lecture for 50 minutes, and at the end of that lecture, students may or may not remember everything. They may have taken notes on everything, but they may not have actually internalized it. Or what you can do is chunk those up into 5 different parts, 10 minutes on structuralism, 10 minutes on functionalism, 10 minutes on behavioralism, and so on and so forth. And each of those is a video in itself. And it's, very learner controlled. They can play it back if they didn't get something. And as you record these chunks of information, you basically focus only on that one part of the topic, that very single focus topic. And that way it's, it's very easy for the students to follow and for their working memory to be processing their information.
Mike, this is Tim Schreffler, everybody. Just wanted to add something to what Mike's talking about chunking here. Chunking works great for adding the content to the learning management system, to Canvas too. So instead of posting one long lecture and kind of just having one item that students can click on and consume, when students come to your course, they see, oh, here I have these several videos to watch, and they can start thinking about how they're going to do their learning and how they're going to consume the content. And you just have a lot more to cover over, a week's time rather than one item. So.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. That's very helpful. And Tim will talk a little bit more about this in session 2 today. Actually, session 3, more session 3. But I think, and tomorrow also, Carl and Steve will talk about how you can put content in Canvas. Yeah. But yeah, the idea of chunking is just critical. You just want to break down your topic down to less than 10 minutes, record that one thing, and then move on. And then last thing I want to cover before we open up for a question is this idea of storyboarding. Storyboarding is a simple concept that is, I use a 3-column table, and I created this as I was working on my presentation. The first column just is the number. It's like each take, if you will. And then the second column is the screen, what people see. And then the third column is what people hear. And so as you put together your micro lecture content, the pre-production work is you just do a screenshot of the slide that you're going to be using, and then in the right column, the very right column, you just do the bullets of what you're going to talk about. And often what I've seen people do, and I do this, is when I do record lecture, I just work through this storyboard, and then as I record, I basically go through it, and as I talk through the bullet points and I go to the next point, I switch. And it's a very scripted process, and it might be a little foreign in the beginning, but as you do this more, it just becomes more natural. It's like news anchors reading from a teleprompter, and as you do this, it just becomes more and more natural, and hopefully it will allow you to be more concise in how you record, so that it's not taking you a long time to get to your point. You've written down your points that you're going to make, and you're going to say those things, and then you're going to move on. So here are some resources that I encourage you to look to learn more about recorded lectures. Mayer's Multimedia Principle is the first one that's listed there, and I hope you will find the materials there helpful, as well as everything else that is listed